Thank you, everybody. Are we good? Volume? Good. All right. So good afternoon, everybody. My challenge, first and foremost, is to keep you awake for the next 30 minutes because you're all going into that post-lunch dip after lunch, aren't you? So what we're going to do is try to be a little bit exaggerated in our presenting skills just to keep you engaged, make sure you don't drift off on me. Okay, so what I want to do, because we don't have a lot of time, I'm going to jump right in. And the first thing I want to talk to you about, there we go, is what exactly is this term fatigue? Because a lot of people think that fatigue and sleepiness and tiredness and drowsiness, that they're all the same thing. But the reality is they're actually very different from each other. So in particular, fatigue. So if we actually look at the definition of fatigue, what it means is it is a decreased capacity to perform mental or physical work. But here's the kicker. As a result of inadequate sleep. Inadequate sleep. That's the key right there, and I'm going to be hammering on that over and over again. It's also influenced by the time of day, which we call circadian factors, which I'll get into in a moment, and how long you've been awake for. In other words, your amount of prior wakefulness. So what you have to recognize with fatigue is fatigue accumulates. It builds and it builds and it builds. All right? We cannot just will it away, okay? We're not going to catch that second wind and it's going to disappear. It continues to build. Fatigue is what is going to create your health consequences, all right? Now, that's different from drowsiness. Drowsiness is that state between being fully alert and asleep. So that drowsiness episode is really when we have, for example, a lack of engagement, where we just don't have enough to keep us occupied or keep us engaged. And that's why I say I'm going to flap my arms around and raise my voice up and down to keep you engaged. Because if I stood up here and I talked like this for the next 30 minutes, you'd all be asleep in about 30 seconds. So we can mask drowsiness a lot of times. We have a cup of coffee, we engage ourselves in a conversation, we do something to move our body and get the circulation again, and that will help offset the drowsiness episode. But drowsiness is not an accumulation factor. Drowsiness is something that fluctuates throughout the day. So in this scenario, it really has an effect from a safety perspective or a performance perspective. So fatigue, as it accumulates, will encourage you to have more drowsy episodes. So now you've got both your health factors and your safety and performance factors that are going to be affected. All right? So they are very distinct. So here are some facts. I know that we have a lot of truckers who work in shift work operations. Just a few comments about shift work, and then we'll get into just fatigue overall as it affects everybody. But from a shift work perspective, the facts are we've got over 22 million people working shift work in North America. A lot of them are emergency services personnel as well as our transportation sector. Now, we know that chronic sleep problems affect about 60 to 80% of shift workers. But you know what? That's almost a parallel with the regular population as well. The average amount of daytime sleep for a night worker is averaging somewhere between 4 and 5 hours. Anybody here ever work shift work? Some of these numbers making sense to you? All right. And over 50% of shift workers, this is a really critical one, over 50% of shift workers do not go to sleep before they report to their first night shift. In other words, they've gone on their day off, and then they've just stayed up an entire day and then gone on to night shift. Anybody here ever do that? Yeah. I'm going to tell you why you're stupid. And there is no perfect shift schedule. And I get this all the time from companies. Just tell me what schedule to put in place and we'll make our guys follow it. Doesn't work that way because there's so many things we have to consider about the design of the job and the tasks that they have to do and the people who are doing those jobs in the environment, we make them do it. It's not a matter of 8 to 4 or 6 to 6 or 7 to 7. It's not that. We have to consider things like age factors. We know that younger shift workers, their biggest beef in life is, how do I fit in my family and friends, right? So they will take ridiculous schedules, and they will swap schedules, and they will work several nights in a row, and they won't care as long as it gives them a big block of time off later to play with their family and friends. The older shift worker, they've given up on a social life. They're divorced. They don't care anymore. At this point, they just want to get home at the end of the day. And while that's tongue-in-cheek, there's some truth to it. We know that shift workers have a 50% higher divorce rate. So the difference is the older shift worker now has arthritis, and they have heart conditions, and they have blood pressure issues, and they have gastrointestinal problems. And all of these things make it very difficult for them to work a shift work lifestyle. So there is no perfect shift schedule. But one of the things we do have to acknowledge is this concept called circadian rhythms, or our body clock. Now, our body has over 700 body rhythms in it, okay? And these rhythms work in harmony with the planet. So circa, from circadian, means about a day. In other words, it's in regard to the 24-hour rotation of our planet. And during that 24-hour rotation of the planet, we have exposure to lightness and darkness. Sun, dark, sun, dark. And that is what controls rhythms in our body. Now, these rhythms tell us things such as, well, you've just woken up, I want you to go to the bathroom now. Or you're hungry, I want you to go and eat. It gives you these feelings of hunger. Or it can tell you things like, now's a good time for you to go to sleep. But they control so many that we aren't aware of. Things like, I want your blood pressure to go up. I want your heart rate to go down. I want certain hormones to be released. So the key to having a healthy life is to actually keep all of these rhythms in harmony with each other. When they go out of harmony, we call this desynchronization, or in more common terms, jet lag. So the mother of all of these rhythms, these 700 rhythms, is called the body temperature curve. And this is important because the body temperature curve is the one that all the other rhythms harmonize to. Okay? So for example, if you were to get up in the morning, you're going to go and start a day shift. Let's say you get up around 4 or 5 in the morning. As the sun goes up in the sky, your internal body temperature begins to rise. And as it rises, it tells your body things like, hey, I want your heart rate to go up. I want your production to go into full key mode, your protein production for your muscle activity. Your functions all get stronger. You become cognitively more alert. Physically, you become stronger. And as that sun continues to rise in the sky, you become more and more alert, more able to do all the challenges facing you. Until you go for lunch. And usually we have what's called this post-lunch dip, or the siesta period. So if you follow that line around, it usually hits somewhere between 1 to 3, 2 to 4, somewhere in that, depending on your own distinct personalities. But that's a built-in mechanism in our body, this little dip in the midday portion. And that's basically a time where the body recharges itself to carry on through the rest of the day. Now, in a lot of cultures, in the older cultures, this would be a time where people would have naps and go to sleep. And we even have this, and by the way, there are handouts at the back too, just so you know. So what happens during this time is we have our brains that kind of just shut down a little bit. They want to repair themselves. They want to become more in tune with carrying on for the rest of the day. So it's during that time that we actually know that emergency services personnel hate that time of day the most, because it's between this 2 and 4 in the afternoon that we see the most traffic accidents occur. People just aren't quite on top of their game. All right? Now, what typically happens is we make it through the afternoon because in North America, go, go, go. We don't have time to nap. We can't take a break. We carry on. And we're going to peak out somewhere here in the lower mainland, usually around 7, 8 in the evening. And then what happens? The sun is going down. And as the sun goes down, our body temperature begins to drop with it. And as our body temperature drops, we start going into night mode. And it tells our body things like, I want your breathing to slow down. I want your muscles to relax. I want your heart rate to drop. I want your digestion to shut off. So as we go into these nighttime hours and our body temperature continues to drop, our body is shutting down in order to repair itself. In the past, we used to think of sleep as just this innate state where we're not doing anything. Our body's working really hard at repairing itself when we sleep. So we need to get sleep in here. But the problem is we're saying, hey, you guys on shift work, it's 10 o'clock at night. Go drive a truck. Well, your body's saying, it's nighttime. Go to sleep. We are what's called a diurnal species. We are meant to do our best work during waking hours in the daytime, and we're meant to do our best sleep during dark nighttime hours. We are not nocturnal. We are not cats, rats, or bats, all right, that do their best work at night. And you can't just take this temperature and flip it upside down. I can't make anybody become a nocturnal animal. Our species isn't designed to swap species. So you will always be diurnal. There are some people that will adjust to shift work better than others, but you will never become a nocturnal animal. You will always do better in daytime hours working. You will always get your best sleep at nighttime hours. That's it. So we have a challenge on our hands. The next point that we have from a danger perspective is that low point where we hit our body temperature low, and that's usually between 3 and 6 a.m. in the morning. And you'll know when you hit it, because it's usually at that point where you're really struggling to keep awake. It's the hardest point of the night shift to stay awake. If you're reading anything or you're scanning anything or you're monitoring anything, you just keep reading it over and over and over, and it's just not registering. But the real key definitive measure is when you go, and you feel that little shiver, that chill comes over you, and you want to put on a sweater, and you start thinking, who turned down the temperature? And that's when you've reached your body temperature minimum, okay? That's important because it's going to tell us things about when we should have light exposure and when we shouldn't. I'll get to that in a minute. So here's some of the things we know from a healthcare perspective, the effects. Now it says health costs for shift workers. The reason that these shift workers have these issues is primarily because of lack of sleep. So significant increase in cardiovascular disorders, in fact, 40% higher for shift workers. Digestive disorders, 6 to 8 times higher. That's everything from just having gas issues to actual ulcers. Rectal and colon cancers, diabetes, 50% increase in diabetes. I'm going to talk more about that in a moment too. Kidney disease and actual tubule scarring on the kidneys themselves. Rheumatoid arthritis, fertility problems for females, both in terms of getting pregnant, staying pregnant, and even then a low birth weight if they do carry to term. Higher chance for respiratory infections and colds, and the inability to absorb medications. This is a really important one too. So if any of you are actual shift workers and you have to take any medications, talk to your pharmacist, not your doctor, because your doctor won't understand chronopharmacology, but talk to your pharmacist and let them know, hey, I'm a shift worker and I work at night. Will these meds work for me during nighttime hours? Because your medications are designed to be metabolized during daytime hours. So they may not even work for you at nighttime. You may need a higher prescription, a lower prescription, or a completely different prescription. All right, so one of the big problems we have is lack of melatonin. So melatonin is our natural sleep hormone, and we call it the Dracula of hormones because it's only produced in the absence of light. And therein lies part of our problem. So when we secrete melatonin, not only does it help us fall asleep, but it's also a very, very powerful antioxidant. And what that means is it mops up the free radicals in our body that actually alter our DNA and cause a lot of our cancers. So there's the link between cancers and people that are shift workers or people that don't get enough sleep. Now, we know that age also reduces melatonin production. So if you don't have enough melatonin production, as you get older, you might notice that your parents or your grandparents, or maybe even yourselves now, you're not sleeping as long as you used to. That's not because you don't need the sleep, it's because you're not producing enough melatonin. And in fact, in some countries, particularly over in Europe, you're not allowed to work shift work past the age of 45, at least not night shift work. Now, the key to all of this, from a work perspective, certainly from a trucking perspective, is light. Light at inappropriate times is going to depress or suppress the production of this melatonin. So if you're working at night, we want as low light as possible, and then keeping it as low as possible until you've hit your body temperature minimum. Once you've hit your body temperature minimum, boom, now we want lots of light. So that's part of the way that we regulate our body and help keep our rhythms in check with each other. But if we've got people that are working at night, such as, let's think of nurses or emergency services where there's a lot of bright light that you're being exposed to throughout the nighttime, you're going to have a lot of difficulty falling asleep when you get off shift. So here is an interesting study that came out in 2015 through Harvard, actually. And what they did is they took people to read a book on the iPad versus reading an actual book. And what they discovered, 55% less melatonin was being produced when they read it off of the book, or read the book on the iPad. It took them 10 minutes longer to fall asleep using the iPad, less REM sleep. They felt sleepier the next day. The book readers didn't have that effect at all. And the next night, the iPad readers' circadian clocks were delayed by more than 90 minutes. So I'm sure a lot of you look at your iPads, your e-book readers, your laptops, your smartphones late at night. And that in and of itself is suppressing a lot of that melatonin production. Okay? So what can you do? Well, some options include stop doing these things about 3 hours before you go to bed. Now, for a lot of people, that's just not going to happen. It's just not realistic. So some other things you can try. You can try wearing sunglasses, orange-tinted sunglasses, because that's really sexy in bed. And the next thing you can try is downloading some software apps onto your devices. There's a couple in particular. One is called Flux, and one is called Twilight. And if you just Google those, you can download those directly onto all of your backlit devices. And what it will do is it will actually suppress a lot of the blue light that's being emanated from these devices, because it's the blue light in these devices that's critical. And there's a big difference between looking at these really close to your face and watching a TV that also has blue light in it. It's the distance factor that makes TV a little bit more acceptable. But having it close to your face, really harsh. Now, Apple actually has in their latest operating system, they actually have a program called the Night Shift. And you have to go into your settings feature to find it, but it will automatically adjust and turn down your lighting at nighttime so that it takes on kind of a pinkish hue. All right, so let's talk about sleep, because that's the critical part right here. So when we look at our day, we can break it down into 3 periods typically. We have our sleep period, our family and recreation period, and our work period. Now in our busy world, what do we consistently cut back on? Sleep, yeah, because we got to work, we need the money, and we certainly want to have family and friends around us. So we tend to cut back, so much so that in the last 100 years, we have gone from over 9 hours of sleep on average to less than 7 hours of sleep. Why? What happened 100 years ago? More specifically with the Industrial Revolution. The electric light, yeah, that darn Thomas Edison. So what, I don't even know if it's him anymore. They're saying he didn't even create it now. I don't know. But somebody invented that darn light bulb, and that was our problem right there. It used to be when the sun got up, we got up. When the sun went down, we went down. There was nothing left to do in the dark except procreate. We used to be pretty good at that, not so much anymore. But the problem is we've now got this manufactured daylight. So we shove more into our day, into that manufactured day, at the expense of not going to bed and not getting our sleep and not being in dark hours. All of that has consequences. So I've been talking about quantity here, but what's more important, quantity versus quality? Well, in all honesty, both are very important, but for very, very different reasons. Most of your quality sleep is going to come on very early in the sleep process when you go to bed at night. It'll be within the first 4 hours. Hit that again in a moment. And only sleep can cure fatigue. You cannot Tim Horton it away. You cannot Starbuck it away. You cannot Red Bull it away. Fatigue accumulates. It is like hunger. If you are hungry, you need food. If you are thirsty, you need water. If you are fatigued, you need sleep. That's the only thing that will get fatigue out of your body. Everything else is a temporary mask. That's it. So let me describe sleep for you so you better understand how this works. In the light stages of sleep, we have stages 1 and 2. And this is what we call the first phase. It's called non-REM sleep. So this is where, stage 1, this is where you first put your head on the pillow and you close your eyes. And what happens is your brain waves slow from an alpha state and they slow down to what we call theta waves. And at this point, it starts telling the body things like, you know what, I'm going to slow down your breathing a little bit. I want your muscles to relax a little bit. And this will last about, 5 to 10 minutes in total. Then you're going to drift off a little bit more and you're going to drop into stage 2. Now this is still a very light stage of sleep. At this point, brain waves are slowing a little further, muscles relax more. You're basically just kind of drifting off into unconsciousness. Now, it's during this phase in stage 1 that if I tried to wake you up, guys, you're sitting on the couch, you got that remote control firmly gripped in hand, your eyes are closed, head's back, and as soon as we try to remove that remote control from your hand, what happens? You wake up, I'm watching that, yeah, right? You've all been there, you know what I'm talking about. And that's because when you're in a really light stage of sleep, you'll often even deny you were in a sleep state because you quickly wake up and you get your bearings and you're right back into things. That's stages 1 and 2, that's light sleep. Then you drop into deep sleep. This is your quality sleep. This is the long, slow delta waves of the brain waves. At this point, this is crucial because this is the only time that the brain releases the human growth hormone. And that is critical for repairing all of your organ function, all of your muscle tissues, and most importantly, for repairing your immune system. So you need to get to delta deep wave sleep because that's what's going to physically repair your body. Now, during this phase of sleep, basically your brain is shut down and not doing too much. It's the body that's working really, really hard. Now, if I woke you up in this stage, you would wake up in what we call this state of sleep inertia. First off, it'd be very hard to wake you up. And if we do wake you up, you're very groggy, you're out of sorts, you don't know what's going on, and it'll take you quite a while for you to get your bearings. If you don't get to delta sleep, you're going to be one of those people who's always having these muscle aches and pains, just always feeling lethargic, unrefreshed, and you're probably running around with a runny nose or a cold constantly or some kind of flu. Now, here's how the sleep cycle works. When you put your head on the pillow, you go into that non-REM sleep phase. You go stage 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you reverse back out. 3, 2, 1. Sorry, my watch is falling apart here. 3, 2, 1. And then you hit REM sleep. So this phase, 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1, that takes in total about an hour and a half or so. Then you hit REM sleep, which lasts about 30 minutes. What is REM? Rapid eye movement. So it's our dreamscape. So at this point, everything switches around. The body becomes effectively paralyzed, and the brain kicks in to hyper mode. And it starts to cognitively repair itself. So we need REM sleep because it's very important for us to handle the psychological stresses of the day. It enhances our cognitive function. We're able to react in the right manner, or be able to decide better decision-making. We have better challenges, or we can handle better challenges when it comes to complex decision-making. And it also gives us that subjective sense of refreshment. So what that means is we have, at this point, the ability to control our stressful environment if we get the proper amount of sleep and we get to REM sleep. The other thing that happens during this phase is it's memory consolidation. It's the only time that the memory will consolidate what you've learned over the course of the day and remember things. So we need to get to REM sleep. So if you do this cycle, let's say you slept for 8 hours. This cycle would take approximately an hour and a half to 2 hours to complete. So you'd go 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1, REM. 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1, REM. If you slept 8 hours, you'd probably repeat that close to 4 times. Now, how much is enough? It's predetermined in every one of us genetically. Most of us will require 8 hours of sleep in order to fully, functionally perform at our best the next day. If we miss out on 1 hour, we're going to see it in performance the very next day. And if you want evidence of that, pay attention every time we do our daylight savings time. That is the #1 day that we have more traffic accidents than any other time, all because we can't handle a 1-hour shift change. And yet we have shift workers who are constantly changing. And no matter what you think, you cannot train yourself to get by on less sleep than what you are programmed for. Yes, you can set your alarm so you only get 4 hours of sleep, and then you get up and you go do your duties. But here's the thing. Being awake is not enough. All right? Simply having your eyes open is not enough. Your performance is not at par with what it should be if you were well rested. So quick question. How many of you average at least 8 hours of sleep a day? Yeah, we hate you. How many average 7 hours of sleep? Closer to 7. Closer to 6. Less than 6. Okay, you leave the parking lot last. Okay. So here's another way to look at that sleep pattern. You put your head on the pillow, stage 1, you drop into stage 2, that's your light stages of sleep, then you get into your deep sleep, 3 and 4. This is the hours after going to bed. So if you sleep for 4 hours, most of your time is going to be spent down here in the delta sleep, the good quality sleep, repairing your body. The longer you sleep, your body transitions and you spend more time in REM, all right? Memory consolidation, handling stresses, cognitive functioning. So if you're constantly cutting your sleep short, you're really cutting out a lot of REM sleep. So you're going to have a lot of more cognitive impairments, all right? Here's what we know. When you regularly cut back on your sleep, particularly 6 hours or less, that is a critical number, then you start having chronic sleep loss. And this is the #1 reason that shift workers die younger than any other than people who are not shift workers. And the average is somewhere between, depending on the studies you read, 7 and 10 years difference. It accelerates aging. That is the reason. Nothing does more damage to your body than sleep restriction, not getting the amount of sleep that you need. It affects every cell in your body. It's more important than what you eat, than what you drink, than what you smoke. Sleep is the key to your health. It's also been proven to be connected to Alzheimer's as well as many dementias out there. We also know that it affects hormonal imbalances, decreased sensitivity to insulin. This is why we have such an increase in diabetes. We also have a lot of weight gain that goes on, or what we call metabolic syndrome. We know that there's a decrease in leptin, and that's the one that tells us, you know what, you're full, don't eat anymore. And then we have an increase in ghrelin hormone, which increases our cravings for carbohydrates and a lot of sugars. So those two combined is a real nasty situation, especially for people who sit still in vehicles. You're going to have a much higher chance of getting into metabolic state. This was a study that was done, initiated by the BC Forest Safety Council in conjunction with Dealey Roberts out of London and Weyerhaeuser, actually. And they examined a whole bunch of different injury rates, accident rates in long-haul truck drivers and log haulers. And what they discovered is that 75% of the operators tested were obese, and 37% were undiagnosed pre-diabetics. 11% were actually fully diabetic. So, simply by the nature of the job, the fact that you are operating in dark hours when you should be sleeping, the fact that you are cutting back on sleep, the fact that you are in a sedentary job that doesn't encourage movement, which activates a lot of these hormones to be released, all of those add up to metabolic syndrome and some major health consequences. From a sleep disorder perspective, 40% of Canadians right now have sleep disorders that are undiagnosed. We, last year alone, spent $20 million on sleep aids in Canada. That's a lot of money. And these are some very typical sleep disorders. Now, the interesting thing about every one of these is that it doesn't have to be you that has a sleep disorder. It could be anybody in your household. If their sleep is disrupted, it could very likely be affecting you. If you're sharing a bed with somebody who sleepwalks or has bruxism or has periodic limb movement where their legs are kind of jerking around all the time, all of those can affect your ability to get a good quality sleep. Now, the interesting thing about all of this is that we can treat a lot of these with sleep medication. But sleep meds are not the answer because they're not treating the problem, they're just treating the symptoms. These are all symptoms. And the majority of these types of sleep disorders have their root in stress. So again, we need to deal with what are the stressors in our life and how can we better deal with them. But it becomes a vicious cycle because if we don't get a lot of good sleep, it's hard to deal with the stress we have in our life. Now, the biggest sleep disorder that we're concerned about is obstructive sleep apnea, and particularly for the trucking industry. We know that 29% of commercial drivers have significant OSA or obstructive sleep apnea. That's compared to about 6% of the general population. It increases blood pressure and heart disease due to the starvation of the heart of oxygen. For those who aren't aware, what sleep apnea is, you actually stop breathing during nighttime. And it's because of, it could happen in a variety of ways. One is because you're a very large person and the weight of the tissue in your neck compresses the airway shut while you're trying to sleep, and it cuts off airflow. It could also be that you have very large tonsils, or your tongue is very large and it falls back and blocks the airway, or it could be that you have a very narrow palate and doesn't allow enough oxygen in. So it's not just large people that get obstructive sleep apnea. It could be any size person, and it can also be children. And we know that those untreated as truck drivers, they are 4 to 5 times more likely to be involved in a crash. That is their fault. So this is a big problem within the industry. Now, we know that fatigue is dangerous. And there's a couple of ways that it affects us. So the first way that it affects us is we go into what's called automatic behavior syndrome, or autopilot. Have you ever pulled into your driveway and you sit there for a second, you kind of go, how'd I get here? Right? At the end of the day, you go home and it's like, I don't remember any of the traffic. I don't remember any lights I went through or stop signs. And thank goodness you didn't have, an elk or a deer or something run across the road, or a child chasing a ball or something, because you may not have noticed it. But the next step, the worst situation, is when you have accumulated what we call sleep debt, so much sleep debt, you've been cutting your sleep short constantly, that now your brain says, you know what, you haven't been looking after me, screw you, I'm out of here. And it goes, and it shuts off. And now you have no sensory perception. You don't hear anything, you don't see anything. And you're operating that 3,000-4,000 pound vehicle down a road with no sensory input at all. So as you're driving, if you have a microsleep, and you have a microsleep of about 5 seconds, and this could last for up to 30 seconds, if you have a 5-second microsleep and you're traveling down the highway going about 100 k an hour, you've now gone the distance of 2 football fields. So try this on the way home. Close your eyes, hit the gas. Kidding. But see how far you can go. So what that means is that we're going to see a lot of traffic accidents. We know that 30% of vehicle accidents and 50% of highway fatalities are related to driver fatigue. Now, some people will try to offset fatigue by engaging in things such as texting, because they're trying to stay awake, they're trying to stay engaged. So now it's also a distracted driving scenario. Of these, 40% had been awake for more than 17 hours. That's a critical number. And 50% had less than 6 hours of sleep the day before the incident. So, motor vehicle accidents, we know that they tend to be, from a fatigue perspective, if it's a fatigue-related crash. And how do we know it's a fatigue-related crash? Because when we show up, we don't see anything. No skid marks, no brake marks. All we know is that whoever witnessed the incident said there was no driver steering behavior. They didn't try to prevent the accident from occurring. They just drifted off the road, or they drifted across the center line and hit the other vehicle. And they're typically a situation where it's high speed, because as we get tired and we go to sleep, basically our body weight will fall forward a lot of times, and we can put our foot onto the gas a little harder. So it's often a high-speed scenario, typically a single vehicle accident, but they can hit others, and it ends up in basically death. These guys perish. Now, how's that different from a drunk driving situation? Who survives in the drunk driving situation? The drunk. Now, what have you heard? Why did the drunk survive? Because how many have heard their bodies are relaxed? That's why they survive. Yeah, wrong. Okay. If you think about this logically, who's actually more relaxed? The person who's actually asleep in a microsleep state, or the person who's just drunk and kind of asleep? I would think the person who's really, really, really asleep. And they perish. So it's not about relaxation. And in fact, all that means is when your body is relaxed, it means that your muscles and your bones can absorb more impact. It doesn't start your organs, stop them from ripping away from inside the body, which is the source of internal bleeding, which is why most people die. So, what do you do? What are the things that you do to keep yourself awake on the way home when you're tired? What are some tricks you've learned?
Crank up the radio, roll down the window, drink coffee, smoke cigarettes, and turn your radio up really loud.
All at the same time. Anybody else? She's got them nailed. There's a lot of them. Okay, now that might be enough to get you home at the end of the day safely, but if you've still got another hour on the road, 2 hours, 3 hours, it doesn't work for those long distances. So turning up the radio, blasting cold air at your face, singing, chewing gum. I have one guy say he slaps his face. Another guy says tickling the roof of your mouth. And then another guy said, well, what if I'm tickling the roof of somebody else's mouth? And then just deteriorated from there. Stopping to run around the vehicle twice. I had one guy say to me, well, first there's a woman. The woman came up and said, oh, no, she's got the best solution. What she does is she takes her hair and she rolls it up in the window. So if she starts to nod off, it pulls her back up again. And then I had a guy, and he has the ultimate solution. What he does is he carries a pair of tweezers. So whenever he starts to nod off in the vehicle, he goes, yeah, this works great. All you do, you grab your tweezers, and you start ripping out nose hairs. And I'm thinking, okay, I can see how that would give you a burst of alertness, but I don't know how you can drive through the cloud of tears. So if that's all that's keeping you on the road, get off the road. You're simply not safe. So I'm going to end it here. Impaired is impaired. This is research coming out of Australia. Some of you may have heard of this already. But what we're able to do is equate the hours of wakefulness versus level of impairedness by drinking alcohol. And through all of their research and studies, which have been replicated several times now, we know that if you've been awake for simply 17 hours, you are now at the blood alcohol equivalency of 0.05% impairment. If you're awake for 22 hours, 0.08. And if you're awake for 24 hours, and how many of you stay awake before you go into that first night shift? You're well aware that you're awake for more than 24 hours. You are now at the blood alcohol equivalency of impairment of 0.10. So we've got some big decisions to make out there when it comes to getting behind the wheel.
But yet it's not treated the same as alcohol or drug use?
No. Absolutely. And fatigue, from a world perspective, Australia are the world leaders in fatigue research, and they have had promotional campaigns on this for over 20 years, and they've significantly reduced the deaths, particularly among trucking situations, because they have long, boring drives in Australia, and they've had tremendous success And we're just now getting that information over here. It's also that sleep research has only been updated in the last 10 to 15 years, where there's been a real focus on sleep neurobiology and what's going on when we are in a tired state. So I know I kind of went over a little bit here in terms of some of the content. There is a handout at the back. I'm going to skip ahead here. Oh, napping real quickly. If you want to nap, short naps are best. Less than a half hour is usually the standard, 30 to 40 minutes. After that, you're drifting off into that sleep inertia state. It's going to be really hard to wake up and get your bearings. So no nap is too short. Short naps are great. Longer naps, if you need a really good long nap, especially if you're just going on to a night shift and you're going to start your truck, have a 2-hour nap beforehand. That'll take you through one complete lap of your sleep cycle, and you'll be waking up in the lighter stages of sleep. All right. Evaluating your sleep environment, there is a handout at the back that gives you a little checklist you can go through to see, have I done everything I can to enhance my sleep environment? There's also a handout of all the slides that we've gone through. They might look somewhat different, but for the most part, you're going to have all the same content. And I'm going to leave it there for any questions that you may have. All good? Good, good. Hopefully you'll be able to pick up some of the tips at the back, and you can enhance your own sleep. And again, sleep is the most important thing in your world, whether you realize it or not. The more you cut back on it, the more you restrict it, the harder it's going to be to live a nice, healthy life down the road. All right, I will be cleaning up a little bit here. You are welcome to come up and ask any questions if you like. Otherwise, handouts are at the back, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Drive safe on the way home. Let those tired people leave last. Okay? All right, thank you.